The autumn air outside carried a crispness that bit at the skin, a whisper of the coming winter. The city bustled with life, but within the confines of La Maison, the world seemed untouched by the chaos beyond its grand, frosted windows. Inside, the restaurant felt like a scene from a postcard. Warm, golden light spilled across pristine white tablecloths, and the soft murmur of conversation blended with the gentle notes of a piano tucked in the corner. The doors swung open, bringing with them a sharp gust of cold air that made a few patrons glance toward the entrance. Standing there, silhouetted against the fading twilight, was Walter McCain. He hesitated for a moment, adjusting his old fedora as though steeling himself for the evening ahead. His suit, a charcoal gray that had faded with time, carried the dignity of a man who had lived through decades of challenges. It wasn't new, but it was clean, pressed, and worn with pride. Walter's hand trembled slightly as he smoothed the front of his jacket. It wasn't the cold that caused it, but the weight of memories. This was the place she had always wanted to visit. How many nights had they talked about it? He could still hear her voice, soft and teasing. "One day, Walter, you'll take me to a place like that. Just you wait." Tonight, he was honoring that promise, even though she wasn't there to share it. As Walter stepped further inside, his shoes made the faintest scuff against the marble floor, drawing the attention of the maitre d' stationed at the front. The man, tall and immaculately dressed, glanced up from his reservation book. His eyes swept over Walter in a quick, practiced motion, cataloging the scuffed shoes, the well-worn suit, the threadbare edges of a tie carefully knotted. His smile tightened into something that felt more like a sneer. "Good evening," Walter said quietly, his voice steady but soft. "I'd like a table for one, please." The maitre d' raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a reservation?" Walter shook his head. "No, I was hoping there might be space for one. Just a simple dinner." For a moment the maitre said nothing, his eyes flicking toward the tables behind him, where diners sipped fine wine and sampled meals that looked like works of art. He sighed, the sound carrying just enough weight to be heard by those nearby. "This is La Maison, sir," he said, his voice polite but clipped. "We don't often accommodate walk-ins, especially during peak hours, and there's a dress code to consider." His words trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Walter looked down at himself, instinctively brushing his hands over the lapels of his suit. "I understand," he said. "I only wanted. Perhaps a more casual place would be a better fit?" The maitre d' interrupted smoothly. "There's a lovely diner a few blocks down." The words hung in the air like a slap, the subtle dismissal wrapped in a thin veneer of politeness. Walter hesitated, glancing around the room. A few patrons turned their heads, their gazes lingering for a moment before they quickly looked away, returning to their conversations as if nothing had happened. Walter's chest tightened, but he drew a deep breath. His voice remained calm, though it carried a quiet strength. "I served my country. I've lived through wars and hardships you can't imagine. All I'm asking for is a meal. One meal." For a moment, the maitre d' faltered, but the haughty expression quickly returned. "I'm sorry, sir, but rules are rules." In that moment, Walter felt a pang of regret, not for walking into the restaurant, but for letting himself believe he could blend into a world that seemed to have no place for him. As he turned to leave, his head held high despite the weight of humiliation, he didn't notice the figure seated in the corner, watching silently, the brim of his flat cap casting a shadow over sharp, thoughtful eyes. The night was about to take a turn Walter never expected. The maitre crossed his arms, the stiff fabric of his tailored suit barely creasing as he regarded Walter with thinly veiled contempt. His carefully curated smile, the kind meant to charm VIP patrons, had faded into something colder, sharper. Walter stood in the middle of the restaurant, feeling the weight of every gaze on him. He could feel the heat rising to his face, but it wasn't embarrassment. No, it was something deeper. A quiet anger, mixed with the sting of rejection, settled in his chest. "Sire," the maitre began again, his tone firm but laced with an exaggerated politeness that only made the words sting more. "As I mentioned, we have standards here. Our guests come to enjoy an exclusive atmosphere, and, well," he let the sentence dangle, his meaning all too clear. Walter straightened his back, his hand instinctively reaching for the metal pinned discreetly beneath his lapel, a reminder of a life spent in service. His voice was steady as he replied, "And I suppose a man like me, someone who fought for this country, doesn't meet your standards?" A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Patrons turned to each other, their whispers like soft waves lapping at the edge of a storm. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others stared, their expressions unreadable. At a nearby table, a woman in a glittering black gown leaned toward her dining companion. "What's he even doing here?" she murmured, her voice just loud enough for Walter to hear. "This isn't the kind of place for people like that." Walter's eyes flicked toward her for a brief moment before returning to the maitre d'. He wanted to respond, to say something that would silence the growing whispers, but the words felt lodged in his throat. The maitre d' stepped closer, lowering his voice, but ensuring it carried just enough to be heard by those nearby. "It's not personal," he said with a shrug, "but this is a place of refinement. Miss," he trailed off, realizing Walter hadn't given his name, and likely assuming it wasn't worth knowing. "Sir, I'm sure you understand." Walter's jaw tightened. His voice, though quiet, carried a firmness that cut through the murmurs. "Understand?" he said. "I understand more than you think. I understand what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself, to put your life on the line so others can live theirs. And I understand that you're standing here telling me that none of it matters because my jacket isn't shiny enough for you." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Even the maitre d' hesitated, caught off guard by the quiet power in Walter's words. But then, as if to reassert control, the maitre d' let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if to dismiss Walter entirely. "This isn't about your past, sir. It's about the present. And presently, I need to ask you to leave. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." The words felt like a dismissal, not just of Walter, but of everything he stood for. He turned to the room, searching for a friendly face, a gesture of solidarity, anything to remind him that the world hadn't entirely forgotten the values he had fought to protect. But the diners avoided his gaze. Eyes dropped to menus, hands reached for glasses, and conversations resumed, awkward and forced. No one stood. No one spoke. The silence grew heavier with each passing second, pressing down on Walter's shoulders like the weight of years gone by. And then, just as the maitre d' reached for a nearby server, signaling for assistance, a deep, steady voice sliced through the tension like a blade through fog. "That's enough." The voice was calm, measured, but the sheer authority in the words brought every conversation in the room to an abrupt halt. From the shadowed corner of the restaurant, a figure rose to his feet. He moved with deliberate ease, his every motion exuding quiet confidence. Adjusting the brim of his flat cap, he stepped into the light, revealing sharp, angular features and a piercing gaze. Tommy Shelby. All eyes turned to him, the silence now charged with anticipation. The room seemed frozen in time as Tommy Shelby stepped forward, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Each step was deliberate, each movement carrying a weight that made it impossible to look away. His dark overcoat hung neatly on his shoulders, and his flat cap, slightly tilted, added to his air of quiet dominance. He stopped a few feet from the maitre d', his piercing blue eyes locking onto the younger man's. Tommy didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence hang in the air, heavy and oppressive, forcing everyone to sit with the tension. "Rules," Tommy said finally, his voice low and measured, "are funny things, aren't they?" The maitre d' blinked, his confidence faltering. "Mr. Shelby, Tommy raised a hand, cutting him off with a calmness that was more commanding than any shout. No, you've already said enough." He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the diners who had returned to their meals with awkward, half-hearted attempts at normalcy. "Let me ask you something," Tommy said, his voice now carrying across the restaurant. "How many of you here know what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself? To put your life on the line so others can sit in comfort, eating their fine meals, drinking their fine wine?" No one answered. The room remained silent, but Tommy's words seemed to echo off the walls. He turned back to the maitre d', his gaze as sharp as a blade. "And you," Tommy continued, his tone calm but with an edge that made the younger man visibly stiffen, "what do you think gives you the right to judge this man? His shoes? His coat? Or is it the fact that he doesn't look like the kind of person you're used to serving? The maitre d' fumbled for a response, his polished exterior crumbling under Tommy's scrutiny. I I didn't mean any disrespect, Mr. Shelby. It's just that we have standards to uphold here. Tommy let out a short, humorless laugh. Standards, he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. You think your standards are more important than his dignity? More important than the sacrifices he made so you could stand here, playing gatekeeper in a fancy restaurant? Tommy stepped closer, the tension between them thick enough to cut. His voice dropped lower, forcing the maitre d' to lean in slightly to catch every word. Let me make this very clear. This man will have the best table in this restaurant. He'll order whatever he wants, and you'll serve it with a smile. And if that's too much for you... Tommy paused, tilting his head slightly. I'll be happy to remind you who holds the lease on this place. The maitre d' paled, his composure slipping entirely. Yes, of course, Mr. Shelby. Right away. He turned quickly, motioning for a waiter to prepare a table near the grand window. Walter, who had been watching the exchange with quiet disbelief, finally spoke. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice soft but steady. I'm not looking for trouble. Tommy turned to Walter, his expression softening. Trouble isn't something you look for, he said, his voice quieter now, just for Walter. Sometimes it finds you, and when it does, you stand your ground. Walter hesitated, then nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thank you, he said simply. As Walter was led to his table, Tommy remained standing, his eyes sweeping across the room. He could see the discomfort etched on the faces of the diners, many of whom now avoided his gaze. But there were others, those whose expressions carried quiet approval, even admiration. Tommy addressed the room once more, his voice calm but firm. This man deserves more than your silence. If you want to call yourselves decent, then start acting like it. A ripple of movement spread through the restaurant as a few patrons began to clap, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Within moments, the entire room erupted in applause, the sound ringing out like a collective acknowledgement of guilt and gratitude. Tommy allowed the applause to carry on for a moment before he turned and walked toward the table where Walter was now seated. As he sat across from the elderly man, he pulled off his cap and set it on the table beside him. Now, Tommy said with a faint smile, let's make sure this meal is one to remember. The applause began as a ripple, one set of hands clapping timidly at a table in the back, then another and another. Within moments, the sound swelled, filling the grand space of La Maison. It wasn't just the noise of hands meeting hands, it was a collective acknowledgement, a shared realization of a wrong made right. Walter sat at his newly prepared table by the grand window, the soft light from the chandelier above casting a warm glow over him. He seemed almost unsure of what to do, his weathered hands resting lightly on the edge of the pristine tablecloth. It had been years, decades even, since anyone had stood up for him like this. Tommy Shelby, now seated across from him, leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The applause was genuine, but Tommy knew the true test of respect wasn't in fleeting gestures, it was in action. The maitre d', still pale and visibly shaken, approached with careful steps, his head slightly bowed. In his hands, he carried 2 menus, the leather-bound covers trembling just slightly as he set them down. I've prepared the finest table as you requested, Mr. Shelby, he said, his voice tight with forced politeness. Tommy didn't look up immediately. Instead, he adjusted the silverware in front of him with meticulous precision before finally meeting the man's gaze. Good, Tommy said simply, his tone calm but with an unmistakable edge. Now, make sure it's the finest service, too. The maitre d' nodded quickly, retreating as a waiter stepped forward to pour water into their glasses. Walter's hand brushed over the menu, but he didn't open it right away. Instead, he looked at Tommy, his eyes glistening with a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice soft but steady. You didn't have to do this. I'm just an old man trying to keep a promise. Tommy tilted his head, intrigued. A promise? Walter nodded, his gaze drifting to the empty chair across from him. To my wife. We always talked about coming to a place like this, but life had other plans. I thought maybe I could honor her memory by finally doing it, even if I had to do it alone. Tommy leaned forward, his expression softening. "You're not alone tonight," he said firmly, "and you shouldn't have to fight for a little respect." Walter's lips curved into a faint smile, the lines on his face deepening. "People like you don't usually notice people like me, let alone stand up for them." Tommy let out a quiet laugh, his gaze distant for a moment. "People like me," he repeated. "Maybe that's the problem. Too many people forget where they came from, forget who they owe." As the two men began to talk, the atmosphere in the restaurant started to change. Patrons who had earlier averted their eyes now watched with interest, some even leaning in to catch snippets of their conversation. At one table, a young couple whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of admiration and guilt. At another, an older gentleman adjusted his tie nervously before rising from his seat and approaching Walter's table. "Excuse me," the man said hesitantly, his voice breaking the quiet murmur of the room. "I just wanted to say thank you for your service, and I'm sorry for what happened earlier." Walter looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. The gentleman nodded and returned to his seat, and soon others followed. One by one, diners approached, some offering words of gratitude, others simply shaking Walter's hand. The maitre d', now standing awkwardly by the entrance, looked on with a mixture of shame and confusion. Tommy caught his eye and gave a subtle nod, as if to say, "Take note, this is how you treat people." When the room settled again, Tommy turned his attention to the diners, his voice calm but loud enough to carry. "You see this man?" he asked, gesturing toward Walter. "He's the reason you're able to sit here tonight, eating your meals in peace. Men like him gave everything, and all he wanted was a seat at the table. Literally." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It doesn't take much to show respect. A smile, a kind word. Sometimes just minding your own business instead of passing judgment. Simple things, but those simple things matter." The diners listened intently, their faces a mixture of reflection and remorse. Tommy leaned back in his chair, his voice softening. "The world's hard enough without us making it harder for each other. So, the next time you see someone who looks like they don't belong, maybe ask yourself if that's really for you to decide." Walter looked at Tommy, his eyes now shimmering with gratitude. "You didn't just stand up for me," he said quietly. "You reminded them what humanity should look like." Tommy smiled faintly, raising his glass. "To humanity," he said simply. Walter lifted his own glass, the clink of crystal against crystal marking a moment neither man would forget. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, its golden rays illuminating the quiet streets. But within the digital realm, something extraordinary was unfolding. Videos from the night before, captured discreetly by patrons at La Maison, had begun spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. Clips of Tommy Shelby standing beside Walter, his commanding voice slicing through the tension, were shared with captions like, "A lesson in respect we all needed," and "This is how you stand up for dignity." Within hours, the story had gone viral, amassing millions of views. Comments poured in from people around the world. "This brought tears to my eyes. We need more people like Tommy. Walter is a hero. Thank you for your service, sir. How can I help? Is there a way to support veterans like Walter?" News outlets picked up the story, sharing headlines such as "Businessman Defends Elderly Veteran in Powerful Act of Solidarity," and "Tommy Shelby Reminds Us What Humanity Looks Like." Walter's story became a rallying point for conversations about respect, dignity, and the quiet sacrifices made by veterans who often go unnoticed. People began organizing fundraisers, not just for Walter, but for local veteran support groups, igniting a wave of compassion that extended far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Walter, who had spent much of his life in the background, now found himself in the spotlight. Journalists reached out to hear his story, and strangers approached him on the street, thanking him for his service and apologizing for the way he had been treated. But Walter, true to his humble nature, often deflected the attention. "It's not about me," he would say. "It's about remembering the people who gave everything and treating everyone with the respect they deserve." Still, there was a quiet joy in seeing the world finally listen. For years he had felt invisible, but now he was a symbol of resilience and dignity, a living reminder that kindness and courage could turn even the harshest moments into something beautiful. As the story continued to spread, Tommy Shelby remained as enigmatic as ever. He refused interviews and turned down offers to comment publicly on the incident. For him, it wasn't about publicity. It was about doing what was right. When asked by one persistent journalist why he had intervened, Tommy's response was brief but unforgettable. Respect is the simplest thing to give, but it seems to be the hardest for some to understand. Despite his reluctance to step into the limelight, Tommy's actions inspired countless others to reflect on their own behavior. People began sharing stories of standing up for others, small acts of kindness, and moments where they chose empathy over judgment. The ripple effect grew, each story adding to a wave of positivity that reached across countries and cultures. One quiet afternoon, Tommy visited Walter at his modest home. The two men sat on the porch, sipping coffee as the sun dipped below the horizon. "I never thought one dinner could change so much," Walter said, a soft chuckle escaping him. "But here we are." Tommy shrugged, a faint smile playing on his lips. "It wasn't the dinner. It was you. People saw you, Walter, and they saw what they should have seen all along, a man who's lived with dignity, even when the world hasn't always returned the favor." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And they saw you, Tommy, a man willing to remind them of it." The two sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the world carry on as if nothing had changed, even though they both knew it had. In the weeks that followed, La Maison announced a partnership with a local veterans organization, offering free meals and hosting events to honor their contributions. The maître d', who had been at the center of the controversy, publicly apologized and began volunteering at a shelter for homeless veterans, a gesture that, while small, marked the beginning of his own transformation. Walter's life changed, but not in the way most would expect. It wasn't the fame or newfound attention that mattered to him. It was the quiet recognition, the letters, the handshakes, the stories from others who had been inspired to stand up for what was right. As for Tommy, he slipped back into the shadows, his actions speaking louder than any words could. But his legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had witnessed that night, a reminder that courage and empathy could ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. Does Walter's story inspire you? Share this video to remind others that even the smallest acts of kindness can create waves of change. Comment, "Dignity for all," to honor Walter and every unsung hero who deserves our respect. Together, let's continue the movement of humanity, one action at a time.